While the electric vehicle market is imploding, Governor Pritzker signed a deal to give Chen Li, president of Goshen, hundreds of millions to set up an EV battery plant in Illinois. Goshen is strongly tied to China, our number one adversary, and Congress has linked Goshen to slave labor there. Your tax dollars are being used to fund immoral business practices and Pritzker's failing green energy fantasies. Join the fight against this deal at dumpgoshen.com. Paid for by Breakthrough Ideas.
Well, welcome to The Real Story. We're back, and that's the commercial that we ran all last year, alerting people to the fact that Pritzker had paid Goshen, a Chinese Communist Party-backed company, over $500 million to come and settle in a little town of Manteno. Now, the good news is that the Manteno residents organized, and the concerned citizens of Manteno fought back, and they won in court about 2 weeks ago. They won. Of course, Goshen and the village of Manteno had decided to pursue dismissal on the concerned citizens of Manteno's lawsuit, alleging that, first of all, you violated zoning laws. Second of all, you're bringing in hazardous materials. The judge was having none of it, shut it down completely, and it is going forward to discovery and then to a trial. And I suspect that we will have a great chance of winning down there. So, that's the state of the state in Illinois. Goshen, though, has been a problem for a long time, and a number of congressmen have known it. And in fact, the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party has had a number of hearings about Goshen. Specifically, they even had one right in Manteno. They had a roundtable discussion with Chairman Molinar coming in and Darren LaHood being there, too, along with expert witnesses. And so this is part of the reason that I think the people elected Donald Trump. They are sick and tired of the Communist Chinese Party coming in, buying up our farmland, getting lots of credits. You know what, though? That big, beautiful bill didn't quite do the deal, or at least that's what Steve Cortes has written about in AM Greatness. He wrote, "Don't fund Chinese companies" in the tax bill. Steve is president of the League of American Workers, a populist right pro-labor advocacy group, and senior political advisor to Catholic Vote. Of course, people are very familiar with Steve on AM 560, as he also hosted a radio show here. And so Steve joins me right now. Steve, thanks so much for joining me on The Real Story.
Jeannie, thanks for having me. And it's always great to be on my absolute favorite radio station in America.
Well, that's great. Hey, listen, coming off of that big, beautiful bill, H.R. 1 passage, Chairman Molinar put out that no Goshen policy was included in the bill. He said it was included in the legislation passed today, which prohibits companies affiliated with the Chinese Communist Party from qualifying for green energy production tax credits. Now, I hadn't heard that anywhere but in his press release. So I texted Darren LaHood, and he said the short answer is that no, Goshen itself wasn't technically included, but the bill does include a lot of the language towards the goal of ensuring credits don't benefit China or other foreign entities of concern. The language in the bill is extremely complex and varies a lot by the specific credit. It's so complex that I wouldn't feel comfortable telling any specific company whether or not they qualify for credits. Steve, why is this so difficult to make sure that we're not funding the Chinese Communist Party's businesses here?
Yeah, well, it doesn't have to be difficult is the quick answer. The reason it's been made difficult is because major American firms who have tremendous power in Washington, D.C., want these subsidies, even though they are doing joint ventures with these Chinese companies. So that's their workaround. And I'm very specific in my article, American Greatness, encourage folks to read it, talking about Ford Motor Company and what Ford is doing regarding auto batteries and the Chinese firm CATL, which is a massive Chinese battery conglomerate that is absolutely controlled by and deeply embedded with the Chinese Communist Party and specifically the Chinese military. So much so, by the way, that our own military will not source any products that come from CATL or CATL affiliates and alliances with American firms. But this right now is the unfortunate workaround that will unfortunately happen unless something is changed in this bill. And listen, I think there's all kinds of things wrong with this bill. I hate it in the big picture, but just looking at this specific slice of the bill, we are unfortunately continuing the green energy scams of Joe Biden. And that's bad enough, Jeannie. But on top of that, directing that money to CCP-controlled affiliates who are going to be operating here in the United States. And by the way, I would go even a step further. Not only should we not be funding it, these kinds of alliances and joint ventures in the United States should not be allowed, period. They should be illegal out of the gate, just as, I think you were hinting at that they shouldn't be allowed to buy U.S. farmland. I don't think they should be allowed to buy U.S. real estate, period, any Chinese nationals or Chinese organizations. But to have a joint venture in Michigan with Ford Motor Company, an iconic American brand, right, that used to represent America almost as much as the American flag. I think this is outrageous. It's something that needs to be highlighted and pointed out. And if we can't get it prohibited in this bill, then we need to at least name and shame Ford and similar companies who are engaging in these kinds of practices, because it's a scam economically. It's not a good investment for the people of the United States. It endangers our national security, particularly when you're talking about really critical businesses. Now, I don't view these EV batteries for cars as necessarily a critical infrastructure of the United States, because most of that is government directed and frankly a scam. But the point is, battery technology in general is critical to the United States, right? And then the future does involve obviously a lot more batteries in this country and around the world. And my point is, critical industries should not be pursued in conjunction with the CCP at all, and certainly should not be funded and subsidized by U.S. taxpayers.
Well, I mean, Goshen has set itself up in Manteno as a foreign trade zone. There is fencing all around it. There's a big sign saying that this is a foreign trade zone. They have brought in batteries because they cannot actually manufacture them. They got shut down in Michigan for manufacturing them. So far, that's still in court and going nowhere. It is suspected that they want to bring the manufacturing to Illinois, which is far more favorable in terms of both its court system and its generous benefits. But they're building batteries for Rivian. And Rivian itself is getting $827 million in tax subsidies that were promised to them as well. And both these guys were just flat out cut checks. And what's Goshen doing with that? Buying up precious farmland. So the whole deal stinks. But on top of that, you also referenced in your article, this article by Reuters, rogue communication devices found in Chinese solar panel inverters. And Goshen doesn't plan to just build batteries for Rivian. They also intend to build grid-scale batteries for our solar and wind production. And right now, that is a critical discussion going on in Springfield on whether or not we're going to also fund that boondoggle of grid-scale batteries, which is completely unworkable, 100%.
Right. And listen, I'm glad you mentioned the solar and wind aspects, because, again, these are bad. Take the Chinese out of it for a moment. These are bad investments for the American people, from the jump, right? They do not make economic sense. They don't make environmental sense, and they can't come close. These so-called alternatives, so-called renewables, they can't come even close to meeting the energy needs of America, even right now, forgetting for a moment about the future energy needs, which are going to gallop higher with AI and with the digital world that we are entering. Our energy needs are going to catapult higher. Now, thankfully, we in the United States have been blessed by the good Lord with endless resources, particularly natural gas, under our feet. We can power those energy needs. We can power that AI revolution here in the United States. In fact, we can do it in a way that no other country can. We've got tremendous advantages, but we are choosing through bad policy instead to chase a lot of these green scams and green boondoggles. As a matter of fact, I have a documentary coming out next week on the scam of the wind turbines, on the windmills, which are across Illinois, of course, all across the United States. They are hideously ugly. They're an aesthetic nightmare. They're bad for the environment. They don't come close to making economic sense. And on top of all that, just like the solar panels that you mentioned, where do the critical components come from? China. So we're sending more, not only is it a bad investment on its face, but on top of it, we're sending billions and billions of dollars. Hardworking Americans are spending this money on investments that don't make sense economically or environmentally, but even adding insult to injury, a huge portion of that money is flowing to the Chinese Communist Party. And then also, to your point, on top of it, allowing access to the United States and to critical infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and other kinds of infrastructure within the United States, where they engage wholesale in industrial espionage. And this is not me making this up. This isn't somebody putting on a tinfoil hat. This is the reality of what the CCP is doing here in the United States. But the point is, they couldn't operate this openly, and they couldn't operate at scale in the United States without the willing cooperation of a whole lot of decision makers in this country. And those are both politicians, mostly Democrats, but there's some Republicans playing ball too. And then it's also corporate leaders. And unfortunately, in the private sector, there's a lot of folks who are willing to look the other way, who won't act patriotically, but will simply be focused on how much money can I get via these scams from the U.S. taxpayer in cooperating with the Chinese. Ford Motor Company, I believe, is one of these companies that is shaming its proud heritage in doing so. But we need to expose them, whether it's wind, solar, EVs, anything, farmland. Let's be smart about who we are and what the Chinese represent as a threat to our way of life. And let's be realistic about how and when we do cooperate with them economically. And that should never involve joint ventures in critical industries in the United States. And it certainly should not involve subsidies from Americans to prop up the Chinese.
Well, I mean, you are the president of the League of American Workers. Obviously, you are a pro-American worker, and the Chinese are anti-American worker, if anything. And we've got corporate interests that are finding that they can manufacture anything over in China for cheaper because, of course, you've got forced laborers. You don't have provisions like paid family leave.
Right.
You don't, you don't protect their workers at all. And yet, at the same time, they're stealing our technology. The Wall Street Journal just put out this article by Heather Somerville, the self-driving truck startup that siphoned trade secrets to Chinese companies. All these people, this was too simple, a self-driving truck firm. It shared its technology with a Beijing-owned firm after promising the U.S. that it would protect its IP. We increasingly create the technology. It then goes to China for manufacturing, and it gets stolen there as part of the agreement.
Yeah.
I want to play a clip here. This was on the Barry Weiss podcast. She had on with her Patrick McGee. He was a Financial Times principal writer on Apple, and he wrote the book, How Apple Trained China to Be a World Power. It's really frightening how Apple has basically turned over its entire operation to China. Without Apple, there would not be China. Without China, there would be no Apple, is the bottom line in this podcast.
I think it's fairly straightforward that China is the only place on the planet that has the tech competence in terms of manufacturing capability, certainly the price, the cost, the quantity, the scale. My novel argument is that it has those skills because Apple built them there, right? It's not that China offered something to Apple, that Apple didn't find these skills in China. It shipped people over by the plane load and created them. And so it's this another layer of nuance that Apple is dependent on the very capabilities that it created. And I think this is like the biggest untold story in tech over the last 25 years. And like my jaw was on the floor as I talked to 200 people and sort of unraveled it all. But I mean, some of the numbers, like anytime you're dealing with Apple, the numbers are just crazy. And so the two numbers that really stick out at me are that the number of people they have trained in China since 2008 is 28 million. Okay, so that's larger than the labor force of California. And the investments they were making in China by 2015 were $55 billion a year.
Okay, so when you think about that, there's 60 million iPhones sold in the United States in a year. And in another Wall Street Journal article, Trump presses Apple to make iPhones in America. It seems almost impossible. Ralph Winkler said, you can't pretend that a supply chain that has been built over the span of 2 decades on the back of a labor pool of millions paid a few dollars per hour is something you could move to the U.S. in 1, 2, 3, 5, or even 10 years. Said Craig Moffat, an analyst who writes about Apple. So is that where we are, that we can't actually produce in the United States?
No, listen, I refuse to accept that defeatism, though. Look, with technology, with productivity, with things like I mentioned previously regarding AI and automation, I do believe that we can and will manufacture iPhones and other similar items here in the United States. But here's the point, too, regarding a company like Apple. I'm not saying that, by the way, that transition will be easy, but that transition must happen. We must rebalance our economy. But regarding Apple specifically and other companies like it, but looking at the iPhones, here is an American company that developed amazing technology in large part because of the United States. Okay, we need to be honest about this because of the advantages and protections of operating as an American company. I mean, patent law, deep capital markets, a culture of innovation, the scale of the United States. America allowed Apple to flourish. All credit to their people and to their engineers. But the point is it happened here, not somewhere else, for reasons that are specific to the United States. Now, I think all of us as citizens of this country, as patriots, whether an individual or a company, it's not just about taking advantage of the opportunities of the United States, but also responsibilities then to the United States. I think all of us should be aware of that. And Apple, if they believe that they can develop these technologies here, then cross the Pacific Ocean and produce the actual goods from those technologies with quasi-slave labor in China, and then import it back into the United States to sell into the crown jewel consumer market of the world, which is what America is, and they expect to do that consequence-free, Donald Trump and America First and Steve Cortes and the League of American Workers, we're saying no. there is going to be a fee. There's going to be a consequence if you want to do that. If you make your items here, no consequences at all, right? Open season, have at it. But if you insist on that kind of offshoring and re-entering the American market, the crown jewel market, you're going to be treated poorly in that process. And over time, that means that high value items will be produced again here in the United States. It won't be immediate, but over time they will be. And by the way, the proof here that this will work is look at what foreign money is doing. Trillions of dollars since Trump took office pouring into investing in the United States. Now, some of those effects won't be felt for years, okay? But the point is that process is already beginning. Whether it's the Taiwanese, the Middle East, foreign companies and foreign conglomerates are pouring investments into this country because we're insisting that if you want preferential treatment and access to our market, you've got to make them here.
All right. He's Steve Cortes, president of the League of American Workers, a populist right pro-labor advocacy group, and he's senior political advisor to Catholic Vote. Steve, thanks so much for joining me on The Real Story.
Jeanne, real pleasure and always great to be on AM 560. Thank you.
All right. We'll be right back.